Welcome to Verses and Visions Creative Conversations, where creativity and purpose meet to inspire and uplift. I'm Cassidy Beck, your host, here to explore the stories of artists, dreamers, and changemakers who are walking in faith and using their unique gifts to make a difference. Each episode is a reminder that your vision, paired with God's purpose, can transform the world around you. Let's get started and spark some inspiration together.
At Verses and Visions, we're grateful for partners who support creativity, faith, and meaningful conversations. We're pleased to share a message from one of them.
Hey friends, before we jump into today's conversation, I've been thinking about those small, meaningful things that bring us together. For me, that's often sharing a bottle from my family's premium soda company, Soda Beers. Whether it's crisp ginger beer, smooth butterscotch beer, classic root beer, original apple beer, or apple beer 5, our low-calorie twist, each flavor is a small little reminder of home and of the simple joys. Okay, now let's dive in. Welcome to the Spark series, where faith meets action and ideas turn into impact. Each episode highlights someone who dared to start, dared to create, dared to trust the nudge, and discovered that a single spark can change everything. If you've been waiting for a sign to begin, this might just be it. Let's dive in. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by author Kenneth Chamberlain. Welcome, Kenneth.
Thank you, Cassidy.
So Kenneth was raised across the American West and a former missionary to Brazil. Kenneth built an international business career working with startups, Fortune 500 companies, and organizations around the world before returning to his first love, storytelling. He now writes faith-centered novels that blend history, scripture, and real-world struggles. And he's Spark Award-winning author of The King's Bodyguard, a powerful reimagining of events surrounding King Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem. We're so excited to have him with us. Again, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
As we kind of dive into this, before we get into it, what's something in your life right now that is inspiring you? It could be a song, a book, a quote, scripture. What are you finding inspiration from?
I find inspiration just in everyday living and different things. Just I completed The King's Bodyguard. I actually just the last 3 months and completed another novel. And I decided to try and do a Hallmark-ish romance, but I could never stay in the romance. I had to go into a little bit of a thriller, but it incorporates some of the things that's happening today and how that we need to look at both sides of everything that's happening to understand. If we take just one side or the other, we will not understand the true understanding. And so don't want to get into that story too much, but other than the fact that they do have some altercations with some of the things that's happening today in the lives of the two of my protagonists. So and one's on one side and one's on the other side of the political spectrum. And I'd love to do that in my writing. I've got a couple other books that I've done the same thing, to where one person presents one side, one presents the other, and they learn from each other.
I think that's awesome. And what a skill set that could be learned in our society today, just like you were mentioning. If you kind of look at any issue and research it from both sides and get like a better picture of exactly what's happening, I think that would be an incredible skill set and an interesting book to read as well.
Yeah.
So you've had this full global career in business and consulting before returning to your creative writing decades later. What stirred that desire to come back after so many years?
I've actually been doing it during my career. My career's not over. I'm the sunset years, but I'm still working and writing nights and whenever I find time to do so. But what came from my career is seeing different places and be able to incorporate those things. The story that I'm working with my writing group in the Davis County, Utah, sets itself between Aurora, Illinois, where I used to live with my family, and Bend, Oregon, where I went for a job interview. And so those type of things happen to me all the time. It's something that sparks something. So The King's Bodyguard came about as I was just reading the Book of Mormon and playing around with the idea of how could have you only got the Americas from the Book of Mormon. The King's Bodyguard came from that along with my love of history. And just doing some research, it practically wrote itself once you run into what was happening in the last 15 years of the kingdom of Judah, and then the ending of that. Things just all of a sudden just popped up and it created a story that I'm going, this may or may not have happened this way, but it definitely is a good possibility of how it may have happened. And so that's how the story evolved.
So there was a moment in your story where someone told you that you probably shouldn't write. How did you move past that voice, and what finally gave you the courage to try again?
And I was right at freshman of college. Out of high school, you know, people, teachers, when you start finding something that's creative, you don't try and critique them too much. And so I did a lot of telling instead of showing. And so when I went to college, I only had the one class where we would just kind of met and just brainstorm and did things. And so I wrote a little short story and it was all tell. And that's when my professor said, yeah, you maybe should consider writing. Instead of, you should have taken a little time to explain what a tell versus show was. And so it's kind of put me back. So I guess I'm not going to write. And then it was later when I heard President Teakley said, read the Book of Mormon no matter where you're at. Start all over. And in doing so, my first book, which was a non-fiction chronology of the Book of Mormon, I just actually went through and every year of the Book of Mormon became a year across this, or became a column in the spreadsheet. Down the side was everybody's name who ever showed up in the Book of Mormon, with the exception of a couple of people who were just so little information there's not even worth doing. Then at the bottom, what happened in that year. The middle then became timelines. So like a good example in Alma talks about Captain Moroni being 25 when he takes over the leadership of the Nephite armies. Okay, that happened this year. Back up 25 years. Now this is when he was born. Then the last book in Alma tells that he died and how old he was. He was 43. So I know when he died. So I can look down at the very bottom and see everything that happened in his age. And I saw a whole lot of new things that I never thought about. And it actually it's incorporated itself heavily into the King's Bodyguard, but also a couple of other novels that I've written about Ammon and Lamoni, that there's things that I don't think people have ever considered. So I could see the overlapping of individuals and different things that happen that I've not seen in anybody who's written some of these historical novels about the Book of Mormon. A good example is someone wrote about Alma the Younger and said, well, he was probably 25 years old when, he was out creating problems for the church. Well, his dad was 71. Alma the Elder was 71 at the time. How many 71-year-olds have a kid when he and their wife are maybe around 45, 46? Not likely. And so it's added more years to his age. And all of a sudden I realized he was the reading leader. The forces of the Messiah were just following him because they were about that age. And it's things like that. Who was King Mormon's father? His name is given in the Book of Mormon, but most people never see it because it was given a much earlier time frame. So those are the type of things that my writing comes about, my historical novels. As I start looking at timelines, putting that down first before I put a pen to paper about the story. What happened? So the King's Bodyguard, the same thing happened. After the fall of Jerusalem, historically we find out that Nebuchadnezzar captures Zedekiah just outside of Jericho, which is going up the Jordan River Valley. And then instead of going to Babylon, he's already spent 2.5 years in Jerusalem. He goes and attacks Tyre. Why would he ever do that? And I realized, what happens if Zedekiah had a wife and kids in Tyre? That's one thing we never hear about in the book or in the Bible or in Jewish history. The names of his wives or his kids. All of the other kings, the names, their wives' names, their kids' names were mentioned, but not them. Could they have been entire? And there was after he was going to do in the bloodline, make sure it was all done because he had done everything he could for that bloodline of King Josiah, and every one of King Josiah's 4 sons had rebelled against him, and he was going to end it. And he spent 13 years trying to take Tyre. Interesting, whether it's right or wrong, it's those type of things that brings the story, for me, it brought the story to life, and that's what created the King's Bodyguard.
So, congratulations again on winning the Spark. That's very exciting. I'm curious, why did you decide you chose to tell it from a bodyguard's perspective instead of a king or a prophet? Why did you choose that point of view?
I wanted to first, is this person needed to be able to see from the beginning all the way through to Mulek. And we know Jeremiah didn't make it to the Americas. Hosea didn't make it to the Americas. So, and Zedekiah didn't. So who would have been the most logical person to have made it to the Americas besides Mulek? And that's, I said, let's have somebody that Zedekiah would have trusted and trusted with his wife, unborn child, and daughters. One of the other interesting things is Irish legend says that Jeremiah helped 2 daughters get to Ireland. And they married Irish princes and established the throne of David in Ireland. That's Irish legend. And so my story is that they were actually trying to follow the sisters. But as they got into the Atlantic Ocean, they were driven by both people trying to find them and capture them, as well as storms that drove them to the Americas instead of getting up to Ireland. And I think the Lord uses different processes to get us to move different places. My wife and I have seen that in all of our moves. We've had 15 different moves in 11 different states.
Wow.
Yeah. And sometimes we had a job and lost immediately within 3 or 4 months for one reason or another. I realized the Lord wanted us here for a short term, and then we moved to another state. And all of a sudden I'm calling the bishopric. And then moved to another state, called the bishopric again, and then again. One case, it would happen the day we moved in. Literally, we moved in. That Sunday, they met the bishop. The next Sunday, we were gone. The following Sunday, we were there, and I was calling the bishop business counselor.
Wow.
So the Lord moves us in ways we don't expect. And so that's the reason why I did that with the King's Bodyguard. The Lord wanted me here. They were planning to get in here, is my opinion.
So, have you ever had a moment when you were writing where you felt like guided or like the story was trying to teach you something?
The characters of the story always teaches me things. I will try and outline a story, and the outline is just like a battle plan. It's good until the first bullet fires. And then the story takes off and it leads me in totally different directions. But it was the only way it could have happened. And so I recognized that was, whether it was inspiration or just the way it really, just the best way it worked. And that's what happened. You know, for example, with the King's Bodyguard, I expected to spend 13 years in Tyre, and I'm spending only 2.5 years in Tyre. But I have Nebuchadnezzar, or not, history had Nebuchadnezzar taking him 13 years later. And I think partly if the story is correct, and I'm not going to say it is, because it is fiction, but if it was, I think Nebuchadnezzar is one that when he vows something, he was going to do it no matter what the cost was. And so when the king of Tyre refused to give him, turn over his guests, then Nebuchadnezzar says, then you will become my own guest. And it took him 13 years, but he was going to make sure that happened.
So, I feel like a lot of your characters kind of wrestle with redemption and discovering God's plan. Do those themes come from personal experience?
Some of them do. Some of them come from life's or experience talking with other people. And some of the experiences, for example, the king on the King's Bodyguard's name is Saul. A lot of those did come from my experience. But as the lady who he ends up marrying, her experiences comes from knowing of different people. She starts off as a spoiled brat. At one point, when she first meets him, and he's going to take her her and her sister to Jerusalem, she makes him get on fours and uses him as a step stool. And then eventually she changes completely because he teaches her just through his examples. And so I see that the same way in today's world. Some of them are based on me, some of them are things I saw with other people.
We'll return to today's conversation in just a moment.
You know how much I love sharing stories that inspire faith and hope. I'm excited to tell you about my new children's book, Sheep Chronicles Baptism. It's about Joshua, a curious boy with big questions about baptism, and the parable of a lost sheep named Shannon, shared by his wise grandpa. It's been such a joy to write this story, and I can't wait for you and your family to read it together.
Now, back to the episode.
If there's someone that's listening that set their creative dreams aside years ago, like you once did, what would you say to them?
I would say is that don't be afraid of being criticized, because every one of us can start off and write a perfect novel. We're going to have to rewrite. We've been taught in English how to be passive and how to tell. And in the business world, it's even worse. It's all inactive. When you write, call out activities, and so you're not being critical. But when you're writing a novel, you have to be very active, and you have to be very poignant, and you have to point at things. And so it's a whole new process. Don't be afraid to learn that process. The biggest part is get involved with the writing group. And when they tell you that doesn't work, don't take it personally. Instead, why doesn't it work? And listen to it. And then see what you can do.
I feel like that process of asking for feedback and then being receptive to it is a difficult one because you put like your heart into it. And when someone's like, yeah, that doesn't resonate with me, it kind of can feel personal. How did you, or did that come easy to you where you're like, okay, I'm not going to take this personally. I'm just going to go with the flow? Or tell us what that process was like for you.
No, my first novel too was just like that going, why would someone even do that? And partly I would try to explain it to them and says, no, if they didn't understand it, that means I did something wrong. And it took me a while to get there to where I had to go back in and readjust the story. If I was going to invest so much time in it, I wanted to make that story, I felt like it was worth it, then I have to readjust it. Some cases, yeah, okay, let's just throw it away. It was a good writing exercise and move on. But it's hard the first few times. It's still hard today. You have someone, one story I have is a love story where they only know each other for 4 days before they're separated for 3 years. And one of the persons that says, boy, they feel hard and fast. That says, yeah, and it probably not realistic, but it's the only way to make the story go forward. So sometimes say for my story, it's going to work. And other times, you're right. I need to redo that. So you just got to figure out what your story calls for.
Yeah. I feel like I also have a hard time balancing when someone gives you feedback, like how do you keep it your voice, the story that you want to tell, while also addressing what they are trying to tell you? Because if they're saying this isn't working, like the thing that whatever you're trying to get across isn't coming across, I feel like that is something that you have to listen to, but you don't want to compromise telling your story.
I don't think you really have to compromise telling your story. It's more of a case of using either internal dialogue or you're using events that's happened around it, sharpening them so that the person arrives at the same as you had. Most of the time, the reality is we keep a lot of things internally, but we forgot to add to the story we thought we did, but they're all internal. And so that's what we have to bring out, bring those in, but don't take a whole lot of time. Otherwise it becomes, you take forever to get to the point. So you got to learn how to sharpen that. And I'm working on that one. That's probably one of the hardest thing it is to work on is how to sharpen it and do it in 2 or 3 sentences or less if you can, yet still bring them to that same point so they understand.
Yes, and I will say, I also know what you mean about having like, "Oh, I thought that I put that clearly on the page." but apparently that didn't totally translate. And so it is very helpful to have that feedback because you're like, clearly it says it right here. Oh, I guess it's not as clearly as I want to say it right there.
Yep.
So tell us what you're working on right now.
What I'm working on right now is called The Legacy of the Lazy Bee.
Hmm.
And it's nearly done. It's doing the final edits and such. In today's world, I wanted it to be a national audience, so I kept religion almost totally out of there. The only religious contact to us was at one point the girl asked the guy, says, "You believe in God?" He says, "Yes, I just don't make it to church very often." But it starts with a young lady who watches her fiance, who was a New York police officer, gunned down on the street the night he proposes to her. And so she shuts her life down. They said this is going to be one of those Hallmark-ish romances that couldn't stay a romance. It had to become a thriller. And the other is a young man from Montana who goes to school at Utah State, or gets his MBA at Utah State. And he wants to run his dad's ranch. And his fiance tells him, "It's the ranch or me." And he says, "So you would choose money over me?" And she looked at him and says, "I think I need to go home. You need an ice cream, you need a quart of ice cream, finish finals. And then if you can't change your mind and I can't change mine, I guess we'll back to the market." And that comes the catalyst where these two actually end up meeting. The story is that the background, the New York police officer happened to be his twin brother that his parents separated when they were young, and they're not identical. So my beta readers going, "How come they couldn't tell they weren't twins?" And it says, they're not identical twins. One's a couple of taller, one's blonde hair, one's blue eyed, one's brown hair, brown eyes. But they are heirs to a huge fortune that neither one knew about. And she served as a journalist to Montana to get to know this dude ranch where she meets him. He thinks it's the guy coming. Her name is Jordan. And so he thinks it's Jordan, like a basketball player. And she's also from Puerto Rican and Portuguese descent. So she looks like a Hispanic or someone from south of the border. And ICE agents raid the area too. And so we have some of today's political things in there. But they don't realize is the grizzly stalking them, was stalking them because of being driven by someone who's trying to get them killed. And then later, and she goes to New York and where she's trying to get gunned down, finds out his ex-girlfriend is part of the mafia. And she realizes late what he had that she turned down, and she wants him now to take that. The whole story is just about them learning how to work together. And it ends with her fiance that was killed. His record that she happened to kept was the only thing that was able to put the mafia away. And then they agreed to get married. But it's redemption. It is learning to accept that the city or the country life is not 100% the right way. You have to give and take. And she learns that, and he learns that. It's set up to be a 3-part series. I'm trying to figure out which ways, but we'll see if anybody likes it before I go parts 2 and 3.
So I'm curious, I talk a lot about self-doubt and kind of how creatives overcome self-doubt. Is self-doubt something that you've experienced? And if so, how have you overcome it in your writing?
I don't self-doubt only from college until I started rewriting. And so the rewriting came about from making a timeline of the Book of Mormon. So I wrote my first novel was the story of Lamoni, the story of Ammon joining together. And the third novel is still partway through is the story of the 2050 warriors. So the whole thing of the People of Ammon series, how they would have worked. But the self-doubt never showed up in those because it was a story that appealed to me and I wanted to write no matter what. And so what became important was learning how to write with. And that took years.
So you said you wanted to write no matter what. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Those stories and then a few others were written for either to help people understand some of the things that I want to call LDS fables of the Book of Mormon, or in the case of my one romance story I kind of mentioned a little early on, was for my daughters. I only have daughters. I'm growing up to understand that you may, the Lord may say he's not the right one for you. Don't mean that that's not who was the bad person. The two protagonists never do marry. And like the niece who read that screamed like her in Missouri, and I lived in Illinois. She hated the ending, but the ending I felt was appropriate because I'm right, real life. I don't write fairy tales. So instead, I'm trying to help people see the Lord may shut a door for whatever reason. Don't look at the door, turn around. Is there another door open or is there another window? And be ready to go through that. And even though most of my stories, all of them have some romance in it, most of them didn't turn out, they didn't want them to be romance. My story of the Mormon, the romance part is I feel like that his wife was the one that made him ready to hear the gospel. She's not in the Book of Mormon anywhere, other than the fact she exists and he has 5 kids at minimum. But I gave her a very strong role. It was also for my daughters to see what they can do. And so as I put in my taglines, my stories are not a romance. Romance is just part of life, and without it, life wouldn't exist.
Mm, I like that philosophy. So, in closing, let me ask you if you had to sum up how has following God's direction rather than your own timeline shaped your creative life?
I would have never been able to write most of the stories I've written if I was to try and do it as a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old. I didn't have the experience. Now, I think I have a little more perspective to be able to look back. And that perspective has come from the Lord moving us, like I said, to 11 different states, 15 different places. And met a lot of people. I've heard things like having a coworker whose husband was a pastor telling another coworker it's okay to have sex once you're engaged because once you know you love each other, it's fine. Lord has no problem with it. And then watch her break up a few days after that and feel like she's ready to commit suicide because she didn't follow the Lord's commandments, even though they're not members of the church. And I use that in a couple of my books because I think it's so important for people to understand, regardless of whether you're a member of the church or not. I try to write, my last few books have been more for the worldwide audience. King's Bodyguard. It's a worldwide audience, or at least if you believe in the Old Testament. The latest book I'm working, like I said, is for a national audience or worldwide audience. But it tells universal truths.
So, what kind of universal truths are you trying to hone in on? And how did you decide which ones you wanted to talk about?
The ones in the latest book, again, sexual purity, politics, and that there are, you know, all conservatives and liberals alike don't have 100% of the truth. It lies somewhere between the two of them. But there are truths, such as sexual purity, such as being truthful, being honest. Doesn't matter where you are. They're universal. King's Bodyguard, it was more of caste systems. The lady that the Saul that he marries, and she was the wife of King Zedekiah's sister. King Zedekiah's wife's sister. And she was just felt like if you weren't at her level or higher, you were the dregs. And she had to learn that even the lowest scullery is made. And she tells him that you're always trying to make me see people below him, including the scullery maid. Says, "Yeah, they make your food. You better be careful there." Type of a thing. So I don't try and get every truth in there. Just different truths depending on what the story has, but I try and put in eternal truths.
So, where can people find you? How can we support you?
Well, this is available again on Amazon. I do have a Facebook, Kenneth Chamberlain author that I'm just trying to get started. It does have a list of the books that I've written, getting some feedback on which one you want me next to get finished and get them edited. But I think the next one coming out will either be The Cartel, which I haven't mentioned at all, but it is a dystopian romance set in today's world 40 years in the future with flashbacks. Young lady from Chicago, liberal. Both of my characters are African American. But he's based on my cousin's kids. They adopted 5 African American mixed race kids. And his family is my cousin's family. She's based on people I knew when I lived in Chicago. So it's either that one or the one I just mentioned, The Lazy Bee, is going to be my next one that I will end up publishing. And then it'll be The Lazy Bee or The Cartel. The problem with The Cartel is no sex, swearing very, very minimal, but violence. And I didn't have any way of dealing. You can think what the cartel is. The violence is not graphic, but it had to be. You couldn't have the story without it.
Do you have any last kind of thoughts or things we haven't mentioned yet?
No, other than if you love history, try The King's Bodyguard. You go on my Facebook or send me an email to kchamber4@gmail.com saying, I want to hear the Book of Mormon stories, because those are very close to where I could release those as well. What people might want to hear.
You've got a lot of works in progress. It's exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, congratulations again.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thanks so much for spending time with me today. If you're looking for a family-friendly, refreshing drink, check out Soda Bears, my family's premium soda company. And for a faith-filled story to share with the little ones, don't miss Sheep Chronicles Baptism. Both are available on Amazon. Until next time, keep creating with purpose and faith.